She thought her secret was safe for 20 years, it wasn't. My name is Danielle Osei Marchetti. I'm 46 years old and I'm a certified public accountant in Providence, Rhode Island. For 20 years, my older sister Camille believed she had successfully hidden the fact that she'd forged our late father's signature on a life insurance beneficiary change. 6 weeks before he died of pancreatic cancer in 2004, redirecting $210,000 away from a trust meant to be split evenly among his 4 children, and routing it entirely into her own name. I found out the truth 11 years ago in 2014, sitting in my father's old study going through boxes nobody had touched since his funeral. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that from the very first sentence of this story because it's the part people find hardest to understand. I knew with total certainty for 11 years and I said nothing. I'm telling you this story now because 6 weeks ago, at my niece Simone's wedding, standing in a rented ballroom in Newport with 200 guests watching, Camille raised a champagne glass, looked directly at me and said, in front of our entire extended family, "Some of us actually earned what we have instead of just riding along on other people's success." She meant it as a small, deniable dig, the kind she'd been landing for 2 decades, always calibrated just enough to sting without ever quite justifying a response. I want to walk you through that toast a little more slowly than I normally would open a story, because I think the specific texture of that evening matters to understanding everything that came after it. The ballroom at the Chandler Estate in Newport was the kind of venue Camille had insisted on for her only daughter's wedding, ocean views through floor-to-ceiling windows, a string quartet during cocktail hour. A florist bill I'd later learn entirely by accident had come to nearly $18,000. I remember standing near the back of the room during the toasts, my husband David's hand resting lightly on my shoulder, watching Camille rise from her seat at the head table in a champagne-colored gown that had clearly cost more than my own wedding dress had, decades earlier, and beginning what she'd framed in her opening line as a mother's reflection on what it means to build something real for your children. She spoke for nearly 6 minutes, longer than any other toast that evening, describing her own journey as a young single mother in her early 30s, the years of scraping together every dollar to build the life that had allowed her to give Simone a wedding like this one. A narrative I'd heard in slightly different forms at nearly every family gathering for the better part of 2 decades. I watched the guests around me nod along, genuinely moved, several dabbing at their eyes, entirely unaware that the scraping together Camille described so movingly had, according to a forensic document examiner's report sitting in a folder in my home office at that very moment, actually begun with $210,000 that had never legally belonged to her alone. It was near the end of the toast, raising her glass toward the head table where I sat with my own family, that she added the line I opened this story with, "Some of us actually earned what we have instead of just riding along on other people's success." A comment technically addressed to the room at large but delivered unmistakably with her eyes fixed directly on mine. I want to be precise about what that specific sentence was doing, because I think its construction reveals something important about the entire 20-year pattern I'm about to describe. It wasn't a direct accusation. It couldn't be challenged without me appearing petty, or worse, without me appearing to confirm some private insecurity Camille was implying I harbored about my own more modest, steadily built career. It was calibrated, the way so many of her comments had been calibrated for 2 decades, to land precisely and deniably at once, a small, sharp thing wrapped in language soft enough that objecting to it would have made me, not her, look unreasonable in front of 200 wedding guests. I raised my own glass along with everyone else in the room. I smiled. I said nothing at the toast, the same way I had said nothing at dozens of similar comments across 20 years, a pattern of restraint so consistent by that point that it had become, within my own family, simply an accepted feature of who I was, Danielle, the calm one, the one who never made a scene, the one who could always be counted on to let things go. What Camille didn't know, standing at that podium in her champagne-colored gown, accepting the room's warm, sustained applause for a story she had spent 20 years perfecting, was that the following Monday I had a meeting scheduled with a forensic document examiner I'd quietly retained 4 months earlier, whose full report, completed just 3 weeks before this exact wedding, sat waiting in a folder in my home office, and that the 20-year clock she'd spent her entire adult life believing had run out on this secret had, in fact, never actually started running at all. I remember driving home from that wedding well past midnight, David quiet beside me in the passenger seat, both of us processing the evening in our own separate silences. I remember passing the exit for Cranston, the town where all of this had actually started, decades earlier, in a modest house I could still picture in exact detail. The kitchen table where my father sat all four of us down about the canceled Ghana trip, the narrow hallway where I used to do my homework within earshot of whatever financial conversation was happening in the next room. I remember thinking, somewhere around that exit, about how strange it was that a single toast, 6 minutes long, delivered by a woman in an $18,000 wedding, had managed to compress an entire 20-year story into one carefully aimed sentence, and how much longer and how much more carefully it was going to take me to unwind it properly on my own terms rather than hers. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake beside David, running through, for what felt like the thousandth time, the full sequence of events that had brought me to this exact point. The study floor in 2014, the safe deposit box, Dr. Castellanos' careful, methodical analysis, 11 years of a private log documenting comments almost identical to the one I'd just absorbed at my own niece's wedding. And underneath all of that careful documentation, I lay there thinking about something simpler and harder to fully articulate. 20 years is a very long time to watch someone build an entire identity, publicly praised and celebrated at every family gathering, on a foundation you alone know to be false. And to say nothing, out of a complicated, tangled mixture of love, grief, fear, and something that had started decades earlier as genuine generosity and had slowly, almost without my noticing the exact moment it happened, curdled into something closer to quiet, corrosive resentment. If you've ever carried the full weight of a truth someone else got to walk around pretending didn't exist, welcome back, this one's for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight and hit subscribe, because this story has a turn in it I think you're going to want to see all the way through. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because a toast in a ballroom doesn't happen out of nowhere. It comes from a lifetime of small, deliberate imbalances, and you can't understand how I finally responded to it without understanding how carefully and how early the family's shape was set. I grew up in Cranston, Rhode Island, the third of 4 children born to Marcus Osai and Diane Marchetti Osai. My father, Marcus, was a Ghanaian immigrant who'd arrived in Providence in 1971 at 22 years old with almost nothing, and built, over 3 decades, a modestly successful chain of 3 dry cleaning and tailoring shops across the city. My mother, Diane, was a second-generation Italian-American from Federal Hill who met my father at a community college night class in 1976. Together they had 4 children: my brother Marcus Jr., born in 1975, my sister Camille, born in 1977, me, born in 1979, and my youngest sister, Renata, born in 1983. Camille was 2 years older than me, and from the earliest age I can remember, she occupied a specific role in our family that I've only fully been able to name as an adult. She was the child my father worried about, and worry, in my father's particular way of loving people, translated directly into resources. Camille struggled academically in a way I didn't, was diagnosed with a learning disability in 3rd grade that required tutoring my parents paid for out of pocket, and developed, by her teenage years, a pattern of financial difficulty that seemed to follow her regardless of how much help she received. My father, I understand now with the benefit of distance, interpreted her struggles as evidence she needed more from him, not less, and organized a significant portion of the family's emotional and financial attention around meeting that perceived need for the rest of his life. I remember one specific memory from 1991 when I was 12 and Camille was 14. My father had saved, over 2 years, roughly $3,000 specifically earmarked for a family trip to Ghana, the first time any of us children would see the country he'd grown up in. 6 weeks before the trip, Camille was caught shoplifting at a mall in Warwick, and the resolution involved a lawyer, a diversion program, and ultimately the full $3,000 my father had saved. The Ghana trip was canceled. I remember my father sitting all 4 of us down at the kitchen table and saying gently to the rest of us, "Camille needs us more right now, we'll go to Ghana another year." We never did go, not as a full family, not while he was alive. I don't remember being angry about it at 12. I remember understanding, with the particular clarity children sometimes have about unfair things they've been told not to name as unfair, that Camille's needs and my father's resources were, in our house, essentially the same category of thing. I remember, too, a specific Christmas in 1996 when I was 17 and had spent the fall working at one of my father's shops to save for a used car, ultimately putting together $1,100 of my own money toward a $2,000 vehicle my father had agreed to cover the remainder of. That same December, Camille, 19 by then and between jobs, asked my father for help with a security deposit on an apartment, roughly $800. My father gave it to her the same week without hesitation from money I understood even then to be coming from the same general pool he'd promised toward my car. My car ended up delayed 4 months while my father figured out the budget. I brought it up to him once carefully and he said, "Danielle, you're stable, you'll be fine either way. Camille needs the help now." I told myself at 17 that he was probably right, that being described as stable was, in its own way, a compliment, evidence that I was the daughter he didn't have to worry about. It would take me another 2 decades to fully understand what that compliment had actually cost me. I want to include one more memory from that same period, because it illustrates something about my father's particular blind spot that matters to understanding everything that came later. In the spring of 1997, my father took Marcus Jr., Camille, and me to visit his own younger brother, my Uncle Quame, who still lived in Accra and ran a modest textile business there. I remember my father standing in his brother's shop telling us with real conviction, in Ghana, the family that helps the one who's struggling is the family that survives. The one who's doing fine can wait. I understood, even at 18, that this was a genuine, deeply held value of my father's, rooted in something real about how he'd been raised and what he believed family owed each other. What I didn't yet understand was how completely that value, applied unevenly and without any actual verification of who was struggling and who was doing fine, could be quietly exploited by a child who had learned, whether consciously or not, that presenting herself as perpetually in need was the most reliable way to receive our father's attention and resources. That was the shape of things from the very beginning, quiet and consistent enough that it rarely felt in any single moment like something worth naming as unfair. Camille needed, I was fine. And for a long time, I told myself that distinction was simply an accurate description of 2 different daughters with 2 different levels of need, rather than a structure that had been reinforced deliberately for years in ways that shaped what each of us came to expect from our father, and eventually from each other. My father, Marcus Osei, was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer in March of 2004 at 62 years old, and given, by his oncologist's initial estimate, somewhere between 6 and 14 months to live. He died on August 19 of that year, 5 months after diagnosis, at the age of 63. I was 25, working my first job at a mid-sized accounting firm in Providence, still years from my CPA license, but already, by temperament, the kind of person who read every document before signing it, a habit that would matter enormously a decade later. In the 6 weeks between diagnosis and death, my father, weakened by chemotherapy and increasingly confused by pain medication in his final days, made several changes to his affairs with the help of an estate attorney named Frank Del Vecchio, whom the family had used for 2 decades. I wasn't present for most of these meetings, trusting at 25 that my father's long-standing intentions, a life insurance trust worth $210,000, established in 1998 and explicitly structured to split evenly among his 4 children, would simply be carried forward as written. Camille, unemployed at the time and living 40 minutes from my parents' house, was the sibling who drove our father to most of his appointments that summer, including, as I'd only learned a decade later, a visit to Frank Del Vecchio's office on July 3, 2004, 6 weeks before our father's death, during which a beneficiary change form was signed removing the trust structure entirely and naming Camille as sole beneficiary of the full $210,000. I didn't know any of this in 2004. What I knew in the immediate aftermath of my father's death was that Camille had been present, exhausted, and grieving the same as the rest of us, and that when the life insurance proceeds were eventually distributed months later, I assumed, without any reason yet to think otherwise, that they'd been split according to the trust my father had described to all of us more than once over the years, evenly among his 4 children. I want to pause here because I don't want the early parts of this story to sound like nothing good existed in our family, because that wouldn't be honest. My younger sister Renata, 21 that year and finishing her last semester of college, flew home the week our father was hospitalized and stayed for 6 straight weeks, sleeping most nights in a chair beside his hospital bed, reading him passages from a worn paperback biography of Kwame Nkrumah he'd always loved because it reminded him. She told me once of home in a way none of the rest of us could give him. Renata and I grew closer during that period than we'd ever been before, a closeness that has held steady, uncomplicated for the 2 decades since, and that became, later, one of the few genuinely uncomplicated relationships I had left inside this family. In early 2005, roughly 6 months after my father's death, the estate began to settle, and I received a check for $31,000 described to me by my mother as your share of the insurance once everything was sorted. I remember being mildly surprised the number wasn't larger. Given the $210,000 figure I recalled my father mentioning years earlier, but I told myself estates were complicated, that taxes and fees and Frank Delvecchio's costs had likely reduced the total, and that questioning the exact figure during a year when our whole family was still raw with grief felt, at the time, both unnecessary and unkind. That was the first rationalization I built and leaned on for a full decade. Grief isn't the time to ask hard questions about money, and Frank Delvecchio, a man my father trusted for 20 years, surely handled everything correctly. Marcus Jr. and Renata each received similar amounts, roughly $30,000 apiece, according to conversations we had informally that spring, none of us comparing exact figures with any real scrutiny, all of us simply grateful in the particular numb way grief produces that our father had left something behind for each of us. Camille, when the subject came up at a family dinner that March, mentioned only that she'd used most of hers on some debts, a comment nobody pressed further since Camille's financial struggles were, by then, simply an accepted, unremarkable feature of who she was within our family. By 2006, Camille had purchased a small 2-bedroom condominium in Warwick, a purchase she described to the family as made possible by finally getting my finances together, plus a little help from Dad's money. I remember being genuinely happy for her at the time, relieved that whatever difficulties had defined much of her 20s seemed at last to be resolving into something stable. I didn't do the math that year on how a $30,000 inheritance, even combined with modest savings, would typically cover a down payment on a Rhode Island condominium in that specific market. I simply accepted the story I was given, the same way I'd accepted most stories about Camille's finances my entire life, without close examination, because close examination of Camille's finances had never, in my experience, been an activity that led anywhere pleasant for the person doing the examining. There's a second incident from 2006 worth including, because it's the first time I noticed a specific rhetorical pattern in Camille's speech that would recur, in slightly different forms for the next 18 years. At the condominium housewarming party that summer, when a family friend asked Camille how she'd managed to afford the down payment so quickly after our father's death, she said smoothly, "I just believe in making your money work for you instead of sitting on it." Some people are more cautious with what they're given. I've always preferred to build. I remember the specific phrase, "what they're given," landing oddly in my ear even then, a phrase that implied all 4 of us had received comparable amounts, when in fact, as I would only understand 8 years later, Camille alone had received 7 times what the rest of us had, and had built her entire "believe in making your money work for you" persona directly on top of that undisclosed advantage. I want to include one more detail from 2007 because it's the first time I recall actively, consciously suppressing a moment of genuine suspicion, years before I'd have any concrete reason to justify it. That same fall, helping my mother organize old paperwork for an unrelated tax matter, I came across a summary letter from Frank Delvecchio's office referencing the revised beneficiary designation from 2004. A phrase that struck me even then as slightly odd. I had understood from years of hearing my father describe the trust that no revision had ever been intended. I mentioned it to my mother in passing, and she said only, "Oh, I think there was some paperwork shuffling near the end. Your father wanted things simplified given how sick he was." I accepted that explanation at the time, filed the letter back into the box it came from, and didn't think about it again for 7 years, until I found its more complete companion documents on that same study floor in 2014. In 2007, my mother, Diane, still grieving and increasingly reliant on Camille for practical help given Camille's proximity and, by then, apparent financial stability, began spending significant time at Camille's condominium, sometimes staying for weeks at a stretch. During one of these visits, according to what my mother mentioned to me in passing that October, Camille had said something that struck my mother as odd enough to repeat. I take care of everyone in this family now, Mom. Somebody has to, especially after everything Dad left behind. My mother relayed this to me as evidence of Camille's newfound maturity and generosity. I remember finding the phrasing slightly strange even then, everything Dad left behind, without having any framework yet to understand why it might mean something different than the generous sentiment it was apparently intended to convey. By 2009, Camille had begun a pattern that would continue for years, positioning herself within the family's internal narrative as the sibling who had made something of what our father left us, subtly implying in comments at holidays and family gatherings that the rest of us had been less careful, less responsible with our own smaller inheritances. At a Thanksgiving dinner that November, when Marcus Jr. mentioned he and his wife were still saving toward a down payment on a house, Camille said lightly, "I used my inheritance the smart way, invested it in property right away instead of letting it just sit there." I remember the comment landing oddly, a small, needling edge beneath its surface friendliness. But I told myself, as I would tell myself many more times over the following years, that Camille had always had a slightly competitive streak with her siblings, and that competitive streaks, while occasionally grating, weren't evidence of anything more serious than ordinary sibling dynamics. In 2010, Camille began referring to herself in family conversations as someone who'd built her own success, a phrase that over the following years would harden into something closer to a fixed narrative she told about herself at every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone celebration. That December, at my mother's 70th birthday party, Camille gave a toast describing herself as proof that hard work and smart choices matter more than what anyone hands you. A toast the rest of the family received warmly, genuinely moved, not yet understanding, as I certainly didn't yet understand the specific irony embedded in that particular sentence. That same December, my own daughter Aisha, then 6 years old, sat next to Camille's daughter Simone, then 8, at the birthday party, the two of them coloring quietly together at a side table while the adults talked. I remember watching them, struck by how uncomplicated their relationship was, unburdened by any of the specific weight the adults in the room were carrying, and thinking with a small, private hope that whatever tensions existed among my generation, the next one might simply grow up without them. That hope, held quietly for years, would eventually become one of the more complicated threads of everything that followed. There's a second incident from that same December worth including because it's the first time Renata, rather than me, was the one who registered visible discomfort at Camille's toast, a discomfort I noticed but didn't yet have the full context to understand. Standing near the dessert table afterward, Renata said to me quietly, "Doesn't it ever strike you as strange how much Camille talks about building her own success, considering none of us actually know exactly what she did with her inheritance in those first few years?" I remember feeling a small jolt of something at that comment. A recognition that Renata had independently noticed a gap in the story I already knew in far more specific and damning detail wasn't simply a gap but an active deception. I said only, "I don't know, maybe," and changed the subject, unwilling, even then, 5 years after finding the documents, to be the one who confirmed Renata's passing suspicion with anything more concrete. By 2012, small comments about money and comparative success had become a regular, almost ritualized feature of family gatherings, always delivered by Camille with enough warmth and humor to make direct objection feel disproportionate. At a 4th of July barbecue that year, discussing my recent CPA certification, Camille said in front of the extended family, "Must be nice to have a job where somebody else's mistakes are what pays your bills." A comment framed as a joke, delivered with a laugh that nonetheless landed as a small, specific dig at the profession I'd spent years building. I laughed along with everyone else. I told myself, as I had for years by then, that pushing back on comments delivered as jokes would make me the person who couldn't take a joke, a label I had no interest in earning within a family that already had clear, if unspoken, rules about which emotional reactions were acceptable from which siblings. In September of 2014, 10 years after my father's death, my mother asked me to help clear out his old study, a room that had remained largely untouched since his passing, its contents boxed but never fully sorted. I spent 3 consecutive weekends in that room, going through decades of paperwork, photographs, and correspondence, a task I approached characteristically with methodical thoroughness, cross-referencing dates, sorting documents into careful categories by year and subject. In the third weekend, going through a box of financial paperwork my mother had never fully organized, I found a folder containing copies of the original 1998 trust documents establishing the life insurance structure, alongside a second thinner folder containing a beneficiary change form dated July 3, 2004, naming Camille as sole beneficiary of the full $210,000, signed with what appeared to be our father's signature 6 weeks before his death. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, holding both documents side by side, doing the math I hadn't done in a decade. $210,000 not split 4 ways into roughly $30,000 apiece, but redirected, apparently in full, to one sibling. While the rest of us received smaller amounts from what I now understood must have been an entirely separate, smaller account, one my mother had likely, innocently, described using language that let all of us assume we were each receiving a quarter of the larger figure. I didn't confront anyone that day or that year or for 11 years afterward. I want to be honest about why, because I think the reasons matter more than the fact itself. My father had been dead for a decade by then. My mother, sorting through the same boxes alongside me some weekends, was 74 years old and still visibly not fully recovered from her husband's death even a decade later. Camille, whatever she had done, had also lost her father that same summer, had also grieved, had also, as far as I could tell from the outside, built an entire adult identity around a version of events that a decade-old signature could unravel in a single conversation. I told myself, sitting on that floor, that raising it would cost more than it would fix, that it would fracture my mother's fragile peace, detonate whatever remained of my relationship with Camille, and force my siblings into a conflict none of us had asked for, over money that, practically speaking, had already been spent for a decade. That was the rationalization that carried me the longest and the one that cost me the most. Some truths are too expensive to tell, and staying quiet is its own form of generosity. I spent the year following that discovery in a strange, private limbo I never fully described to anyone, not even my husband, David, in full detail, though he knew something significant had shifted in how I related to Camille. I made a quiet, deliberate decision that spring to have the beneficiary change form professionally examined, not because I intended to act on it immediately, but because I needed, for my own sense of stability, to know definitively whether the signature was genuine or forged, rather than living indefinitely with an ambiguous suspicion I couldn't resolve on my own. I made a copy of the document, told no one, and filed it away in a safe deposit box separate from anything else in my life, a decision that would matter enormously 9 years later. There's a second piece of that year worth including because it's the first time I actively, deliberately tested my own resolve to stay silent and learned something important about how deep that resolve actually went. That November, at Thanksgiving, Camille mentioned in front of the extended family that she was considering helping Simone, then 17, set up an investment account, the way my dad taught me to think about money early. I remember sitting at that table, freshly aware from my own private research that spring that the signature underlying Camille's entire financial foundation was very likely forged, and saying nothing, passing the mashed potatoes, complimenting the turkey, participating fully in an ordinary family holiday while privately holding knowledge that could have unraveled the entire warm scene around that table in a single sentence. I remember driving home that night specifically testing the question in my own mind, could I have said something right then at that exact table? And concluding, with a mixture of relief and unease I didn't fully understand at the time, that I could have and had chosen not to, and that the choosing itself felt like its own kind of quiet complicity I wasn't yet ready to examine closely. By 2016, I had begun, almost without consciously deciding to, keeping a private, dated log of every comment Camille made at family gatherings that referenced her own financial success relative to the rest of us, a habit that felt, at the time, less like building a case and more like simply needing somewhere private to put the specific, cumulative sting of hearing the same subtle narrative repeated, year after year, by someone I now understood had built that narrative on a foundation I alone knew to be false. At a birthday dinner that June, Camille said of a modest raise I'd mentioned receiving at work, "That's great, slow and steady, right? Not everyone needs to make a big splash to feel successful." I wrote the date and the comment down that night. I would eventually have 11 years of similar entries. I want to include one more detail from 2016 because it's the year I first began to understand that my silence wasn't simply protecting Camille from consequence. It was also, in a smaller but real way, protecting my own sense of myself as someone who didn't create family conflict. At a dinner that August, my mother mentioned with obvious pride that Camille had recently been asked to speak to a local community group about financial resilience after loss, using her own story as the centerpiece of the talk. I remember the specific, complicated knot of feeling that comment produced in me, genuine discomfort at watching a forged signature quietly become the foundation of a public speaking career, and underneath that discomfort, a smaller, more uncomfortable recognition that correcting the record. At that point, 12 years after the fact would require me to become someone I had never once been within this family, the sibling who disrupts things, who says the hard thing out loud, who chooses truth over harmony even when harmony is what everyone else in the room clearly wants. In 2017, my mother's health began declining more seriously. A series of small strokes that, while not immediately life-threatening, required increasing coordination among the four of us regarding her care. Camille, positioned by proximity and by the family's long-standing assumption of her financial stability, took on a formal role managing my mother's day-to-day finances, a role that included, I'd later learn, access to accounts my mother could no longer easily monitor herself. At a family meeting that October to discuss care arrangements, Camille said, with apparent generosity, "I'll handle the finances, you all have your own families and careers to worry about, let me take this one thing off everyone's plate." I remember feeling genuine gratitude in the moment, not yet fully connecting this offer to the pattern I'd been quietly documenting for 2 years by then. That same October, my daughter Aisha, then 13, and Camille's daughter Simone, then 15, had grown into a genuinely close friendship independent of anything happening among the adults, spending weekends together, texting constantly, a relationship built entirely on their own terms rather than any obligation imposed by the family structure around them. I remember watching them at that October family meeting, sitting together on the stairs half listening to the adults' conversation, and feeling a complicated mixture of hope and dread. Hope that whatever eventually happened between Camille and me, this particular relationship might survive it intact, and dread, already forming somewhere beneath the hope, that I might not actually be able to guarantee that outcome no matter how carefully I tried to protect it. I remember specifically driving Aisha home from Simone's house later that same week, and her mentioning, entirely unprompted, that Simone had confided in her about feeling pressure to live up to her mother's story of self-made success, a pressure Simone apparently felt without fully understanding its source. I remember the strange, vertiginous feeling of hearing my own daughter describe, secondhand, the exact psychological weight that Camille's 20-year fiction had been quietly placing on the next generation, entirely independent of anything I had done or failed to do, and understanding. In that car, that the cost of this secret had already begun extending well beyond the 4 siblings who actually remembered our father, into a generation who'd never known him at all, but were nonetheless inheriting the emotional architecture built on top of a lie about him. If any of this is starting to sound familiar, the sibling who built a whole identity on a story you alone knew wasn't quite true, the small, cumulative comments that felt too minor to name individually but added up to something heavier over years, go ahead and comment the word "documented" below, because that's exactly where I was standing by the end of 2017. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is where 11 years of quiet documentation finally becomes something more than a private log. By 2018, Camille's management of my mother's finances had become total, and at a Christmas gathering that December discussing holiday gift budgets, Camille mentioned in front of the family that she'd had to make some tough calls this year to keep Mom's accounts healthy, a comment that, combined with everything I'd learned in 2014, began to sit uneasily with me in a new way. I didn't yet have any specific evidence of new wrongdoing regarding my mother's current finances, but I began that year quietly requesting, through entirely legitimate channels available to me as a family member and a financial professional, periodic informal updates on my mother's account balances, a request Camille found, by her own account, to Marcus Jr. A little insulting, honestly, like she doesn't trust me. There's a second incident from 2018 I want to include, because it involves my daughter Aisha directly, and because it's the moment I first understood how thoroughly Camille's narrative had begun shaping the next generation's understanding of our family, independent of anything I had control over. At a family dinner that spring, Aisha, then 14, asked Camille, with the innocent bluntness of a teenager, how she'd managed to buy her condo so young. Camille told her the same story she'd been telling for over a decade, warm and detailed, about scraping together every dollar and making smart choices. I watched Aisha absorb that story with visible admiration, and I remember the specific, sharp discomfort of sitting there, saying nothing, watching my own daughter build a small piece of her worldview around a foundation I alone knew to be false. In 2019, my mother at 79 began a noticeable cognitive decline, and Camille, still managing her finances, requested and received formal power of attorney over my mother's affairs, a request the rest of us, myself included, supported at the time, given Camille's established role and proximity. I remember signing off on that decision with a specific, quiet unease I didn't fully name even to myself, a low hum of the same feeling I'd carried since 2014, now compounding with new, adjacent worry about a woman I loved deeply, and a sister I no longer fully trusted holding formal authority over that woman's remaining resources. The pandemic hit our extended family hard in 2020, isolating my mother in her assisted living facility for months at a stretch. And Camille, as the local designated point of contact, became the primary conduit for information about our mother's condition, her care costs, and her remaining finances, information the rest of us received secondhand, filtered entirely through Camille's own summaries. At one point that spring, discussing the facility's increased pandemic-related costs, Camille mentioned that Mom's accounts were getting tighter than I'd like, a comment that struck me, given what I knew about the original inheritance discrepancy, as worth quietly tracking rather than immediately alarming about. By 2021, I had begun cautiously discussing my long-held knowledge with exactly one person outside my own household, my husband David, finally after 7 years of carrying it privately. I told him the full story on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting at our own kitchen table, and watched him listen without interruption, his expression shifting slowly from surprise to something closer to quiet anger on my behalf. He asked me, gently, why I'd never told him before. I told him the truth, that saying it out loud, even to him, would make it real in a way I hadn't been ready for, that some part of me had hoped, irrationally, that simply not speaking it might eventually make the whole situation resolve itself without my having to be the one who detonated it. In 2022, my mother's cognitive decline progressed to the point where she was no longer able to meaningfully participate in decisions about her own care or finances. And Camille, holding full power of attorney, made several decisions that spring, selling a small piece of property my mother had inherited from her own parents, consolidating accounts, that the rest of us learned about only after the fact, through brief, factual updates rather than any prior consultation. At a family call that April, when Marcus Jr. asked why we hadn't been consulted about the property sale, Camille said evenly, I have legal authority to make these decisions, and frankly, someone has to be able to act quickly without a 4-person committee meeting every time. I remember the specific chill of that sentence, delivered with the same calm reasonableness she'd used for nearly 2 decades, now applied to decisions about our mother's remaining assets that none of us could meaningfully verify or challenge. By 2023, I had quietly begun, alongside my ongoing private documentation, researching the specific legal standards for challenging a forged signature on a beneficiary designation, understanding from my professional training that the statute of limitations on such claims varied significantly depending on when the fraud was discovered rather than when it occurred, a legal nuance that would matter enormously in what came next. I retained, that November, a forensic document examiner named Dr. Helen Castellanos on a strictly confidential basis to formally analyze the copy of the 2004 beneficiary change form I'd kept in my safe deposit box for 9 years. I want to describe the process of actually retaining Dr. Castellanos a little more fully, because it was, in its own quiet way, the first genuinely irreversible step I'd taken in 9 years. I remember sitting in her small office in Providence for our initial consultation, a room lined with reference volumes on document authentication, explaining the situation in careful, factual terms, watching her take notes without any visible reaction to the specifics of what I was describing. Near the end of that first meeting, she asked me a question that stayed with me for months afterward. Mrs. Marchetti, I need to ask you directly, are you retaining me because you intend to pursue a legal claim or because you need certainty for yourself, regardless of what you ultimately do with it? I told her honestly that I genuinely didn't know yet, that I needed the certainty first and would decide what to do with it once I actually had it. She nodded, said that was a perfectly legitimate reason to commission the work, and told me the full analysis would take approximately 12 weeks. Dr. Castellanos' preliminary findings, delivered in February of 2024, indicated significant irregularities in the signature consistent with forgery, though she recommended additional comparative analysis against verified samples of my father's genuine signature from the same general period. Samples I spent the following 2 months carefully, quietly gathering from old tax documents, greeting cards, and business records still held by family friends and former employees of my father's shops, none of whom I told the actual purpose of my requests. Simone's engagement was announced that March to a man named Julian Ferretti she'd been dating for 3 years, and the wedding was set for June. I remember receiving that news with a complicated tangle of genuine happiness for my niece, whom I'd watched grow up alongside my own daughter, and a quiet, private awareness that the timeline I'd been building for nearly a decade was, whether I fully intended it or not, converging with a milestone that would place the entire extended family in one room together for an extended, celebratory occasion. Precisely the kind of setting where Camille's carefully maintained narrative about her own success had always been performed most visibly and most publicly. Dr. Castellanos's full comparative analysis, completed in May of 2024, 3 weeks before Simone's wedding, concluded with what she described as a high degree of confidence that the 2004 signature was not genuine, identifying specific inconsistencies in pen pressure, letter formation, and stroke sequence that were, in her professional opinion, not attributable to the natural variation expected from illness or medication effects alone. I received that report on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in my own home office, and felt, reading it, less shock than a strange, settled confirmation of something I had already known with total certainty for a decade. I want to clarify something about structure here because this story doesn't follow quite the same shape as most. My discovery of the forgery happened in 2014 on the floor of my father's study, a decade before anything else in this account. But there was a second, smaller discovery, in June of 2024 that functioned as its own kind of quiet gut punch, confirming not the original fraud but something I hadn't fully let myself consider until that point. That Camille knew with total certainty exactly what she had done, and had spent 20 years not simply benefiting from a decades-old mistake she might have genuinely misremembered, but actively, deliberately maintaining a story she knew to be false. The confirmation came 4 days before Simone's wedding, at a small pre-wedding gathering at my mother's assisted living facility, where Camille, not realizing I was standing close enough in the hallway to hear, was on the phone with her husband, Anthony, discussing final wedding costs. I heard her say, plainly, "It's fine, we can cover it, there's still some of Dad's money left over from 20 years ago, might as well use it for something good." I stood very still in that hallway, holding a small gift bag for my mother, and felt something go quiet inside me, not rage exactly, not yet, just a kind of cold, clarifying stillness, the recognition that this wasn't a woman who had, at some point over 2 decades, convinced herself of an alternate, more comfortable version of events. This was a woman who knew, precisely 20 years later, exactly which money she was still spending and exactly where it had originally come from, and had simply decided, over and over, year after year, that the comfort of using it was worth more than the discomfort of ever addressing it. I want to describe exactly what went through my mind standing in that hallway, because I think the specificity matters more than the summary. My first thought, oddly, was almost administrative, the same careful, methodical part of my brain that reviews a client's financial records for a living, a small, cold recognition that some of Dad's money left over from 20 years ago was, in its own way, the single most honest sentence I'd ever heard Camille say about the actual origin of her wealth, delivered casually to her own husband, with none of the careful narrative construction she'd spent 2 decades perfecting for the rest of the family. My second thought was about Anthony himself and whether he'd known this entire time exactly what Dad's money actually meant, or whether he, too, had simply absorbed a partial, comfortable version of the story the way the rest of us had. My third thought, the one that actually made my hands tighten around the small gift bag I was still holding, was simpler than either of those. 20 years. She has known specifically for 20 entire years, and I am the only other person in this family who has also known for 11 of them, and neither of us has ever once said so to the other directly in all that time. I didn't say anything in the hallway. I finished delivering my mother's gift, made ordinary conversation for another 20 minutes, and drove home that evening turning that single overheard sentence over and over in my mind, understanding with total clarity that whatever restraint I had extended toward Camille for a decade, she was grieving too. She built an identity around this. Some truths are too expensive to tell had just been proven by her own casual words on a phone call she didn't know I could hear, to be restraint she had never once reciprocated, and had, if anything, quietly relied on for 20 years without ever once acknowledging it. That night, once I was home, I sat in my parked car in my own driveway for nearly half an hour before going inside, not yet ready to bring the specific weight of what I'd just heard into the ordinary rhythm of my own household. I thought about all 20 years at once compressed into that single overheard sentence: the canceled Ghana trip, the delayed car, the toast at my mother's 70th birthday, 11 private log entries documenting comments almost identical to the one I'd just absorbed. And underneath all of it, the same quiet, patient question I'd been asking myself in one form or another for a decade. How much longer was I actually willing to let this cost me, in exchange for a peace that I was beginning to understand with total clarity had never really been peace at all, just the specific, exhausting work of holding a truth alone so that everyone else around me didn't have to? I didn't act on it immediately, not even after the hallway conversation. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters enormously to how the rest of this went, and because I think the space between finally having full confirmation and finally deciding to act on it is where the real emotional weight of this story actually lives. I called my closest friend from graduate school, a woman named Priya Anand who'd become a family law attorney in Boston, that same evening, sitting in my car in my own driveway for nearly 40 minutes because I couldn't quite bring myself to walk into my own house and say any of it out loud yet, even to David, until I'd said it to someone with enough professional distance to help me think clearly first. I told Priya the entire story, from the floor of my father's study in 2014 through the hallway at the assisted living facility that same afternoon. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then she said something I've thought about constantly since. "Danielle, you've spent 10 years protecting Camille from a consequence she has never once, not for a single day, worried about herself. You need to decide whether that protection was ever actually a gift, or whether it was just fear wearing a very patient, very generous costume." That sentence cracked something open in me, sitting there in my own driveway with the engine still running, because underneath a decade of careful, deliberate silence was a fear I hadn't let myself name clearly, even to myself, until that phone call. The fear wasn't really about Camille or even primarily about my mother's fragile peace, though both of those fears were real and had genuinely shaped my restraint for years. The fear, underneath all of it, was smaller and stranger, and took me most of that phone call to actually locate. If I stopped being the sibling who quietly absorbed unfairness without ever forcing a reckoning, who would I actually be inside this family? I had spent my entire life, since that Ghana trip was canceled at 12 years old, occupying a specific role, the stable one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't need anything and therefore didn't cause problems by asking for it. And some part of me, I understood sitting in that driveway, was genuinely afraid that dismantling Camille's 20-year story would also mean dismantling the only version of myself I'd ever really been allowed to be within this particular family. I want to spend real time here on what that fear actually felt like day to day, across the 3 weeks that followed, because I think the abstract description undersells how physically present it was. I remember waking most mornings that June with a specific low-grade tightness in my chest before I'd even fully opened my eyes, a sensation I initially mistook for ordinary wedding season stress before recognizing it with Dr. Feldstein's help in a session later that month, as something closer to anticipatory grief. Grief for a version of my family I'd been quietly, unconsciously hoping to preserve indefinitely. One where Camille and I remained cordial, however hollow that cordiality actually was underneath. Where my mother's remaining years passed without any further disruption. Where Aisha and Simone's close friendship continued uncomplicated by anything happening among the adults around them. Some part of me, I came to understand, had spent a decade treating silence not as cowardice exactly, but as a form of preservation, a belief that whatever I was protecting by staying quiet was worth more than whatever truth I was withholding. I sat with that fear for nearly 3 weeks before I said anything to my mother or my other siblings. 3 weeks that overlapped almost entirely with the final preparations for Simone's wedding. A strange, dissonant stretch of time spent helping address invitations and attend dress fittings for a family celebration, while quietly carrying the knowledge that I intended eventually to detonate something significant beneath the family hosting it. I remember one specific dress fitting, 10 days before the wedding, standing beside Simone in a small boutique on Thayer Street while she turned in front of a mirror in her final gown, radiant and completely unaware of anything beyond the joy of her own wedding. And feeling a wave of protective tenderness toward her so strong it nearly brought me to tears in the middle of the fitting room, tears Simone attributed warmly to ordinary aunt sentimentality, and that were, in truth, at least partly about something she couldn't have known she was standing at the center of. During those 3 weeks, I talked extensively with David, finally in full detail, walking him through every piece of documentation I'd gathered across a decade. The original 1998 trust, the 2004 beneficiary change, Dr. Castellanos' full report, the private log of comments I'd kept since 2016, and my growing, specific concerns about Camille's management of our mother's current finances under her power of attorney. I remember the particular quality of that conversation, sitting across from David at our own kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, laying out documents I'd kept hidden from him, in full for a decade, watching his expression shift slowly from surprise to something closer to quiet anger on my behalf as each new piece landed. He asked me gently at one point why I'd never told him before, not accusingly but with genuine, careful curiosity. I told him the truth, that saying it out loud, even to him, would make it real in a way I hadn't been ready for, that some part of me had hoped, irrationally, that simply not speaking it might eventually make the whole situation resolve itself without my having to be the one who detonated it. And that I'd worried, too, in a way I hadn't fully examined until that exact conversation, that even David might see me differently once he understood how long I'd been capable of holding something this significant in complete silence, even from him. David listened, mostly without interrupting, and at the end he asked me a single question that reframed the entire 3 weeks for me. What do you actually want to happen once you say this out loud? Not what do you want Camille to feel? What do you actually want to be true afterward that isn't true right now? I didn't have a ready answer for that question, and I think that's important to include honestly, because so much of what I'd carried for a decade had been organized around avoiding a specific outcome: family fracture, my mother's distress, an ugly, irreversible confrontation, rather than around actually identifying what a fair, honest outcome might look like if I stopped simply trying to prevent the worst-case scenario and started actually working towards something better. I spent several more days with that question, turning it over during long drives, during quiet moments at work between client meetings, during a run one Saturday morning that stretched nearly 2 hours longer than I'd planned simply because I couldn't stop thinking, and arrived slowly at an answer that surprised me with how modest it actually was. I didn't want Camille punished, exactly, not in any dramatic sense. I wanted the truth to exist, plainly, as a fact the family could actually reference, rather than as a secret only I carried the full weight of. I wanted my mother's remaining finances protected, given what I now understood about Camille's demonstrated willingness to quietly redirect resources when she believed no one else was fully paying attention. And I wanted, though this was harder to admit even to myself, to simply stop being the only person in the family who understood the actual shape of what had happened, the only person carrying the accurate version of a story everyone else had been told a false one about for 20 years. I talked to a therapist I'd been seeing periodically since my mother's decline began, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Feldstein, about the fear underneath all of it, the fear of no longer being the reliable, undemanding daughter, and what that might actually mean about who I was outside that specific, narrow role. I remember that particular session vividly, sitting in her small office on a rainy Thursday afternoon in mid-June, describing for the first time out loud to anyone besides Priya and David the full weight of what I'd been carrying. She let me talk for nearly 20 minutes without interruption, and when I finally paused, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. Danielle, when you picture yourself finally saying this out loud to your whole family, what's the very first feeling you imagine having before any of their reactions even register? I sat with that for a long moment, and the answer that came when I finally let myself say it surprised me with its simplicity: relief. Not fear of their reaction, not anticipation of the fallout, but simple, physical relief, the specific sensation of finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to walk without its weight. Dr. Feldstein said something during that session that I've carried with me since. Danielle, being agreeable and being honest are not the same thing. You've spent your whole life being praised for the first one, and I think somewhere along the way you started to believe the second one would cost you the praise. It might, But it will also finally let the people who love you know who they're actually praising. I sat with that in her small office, afternoon light coming through the blinds, and something in my chest loosened just slightly, honestly, for the first time in a decade. I also thought during those 3 weeks a great deal about Aisha and Simone, and what kind of example I was setting for both of them, cousins who'd grown up close despite everything happening beneath the surface of the adults around them, by continuing to let a false story stand simply because correcting it would be uncomfortable. I thought specifically about a conversation Aisha and I had that same spring when she was 20 and home from college for a weekend, describing with genuine admiration how put together Aunt Camille seemed. How she'd always thought of her as proof that you can rebuild your whole life if you're disciplined enough. I remember smiling and saying nothing in response at the time, and feeling afterward a specific, sharp discomfort at having let my own daughter absorb, uncorrected, the exact story I alone knew to be false. I thought too about what it would mean for Aisha, watching from the outside as this eventually came to light, to understand that her own mother had known the truth for over a decade and simply hadn't found, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to find, the right moment to say it, whether that knowledge would read to her eventually as wisdom and restraint, or as its own quieter kind of dishonesty, 1 degree removed from Camille's original lie. I want to include one more conversation from this period, because it ended up mattering more than I expected at the time. I called my brother Marcus Jr., not to tell him anything yet, but simply to ask carefully, obliquely, how he'd feel if something significant came to light about how our father's estate had actually been handled 20 years earlier. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that startled me. "Danielle, I've always wondered about the numbers. I never had proof of anything, I just remember Dad talking about a much bigger amount than what we actually got, back before he got sick. I figured either my memory was wrong or it wasn't my place to ask." That conversation confirmed something I'd begun to suspect but hadn't let myself fully articulate. I hadn't been the only person in the family carrying a quiet, unexamined discomfort about the numbers. I had simply been the only one with the actual proof, and apparently the only one who'd ever taken the deliberate steps necessary to confirm what everyone else had only vaguely, uneasily wondered about. That conversation with Marcus Jr., more than anything else across those 3 weeks, more than Priya's parking lot phone call, more than David's kitchen table question, more than Dr. Feldstein's careful, patient reframing, was what finally moved me from private, individual certainty to a decision to bring the truth into a room with my entire family present. I understood, hanging up that call, that I hadn't actually been protecting a fragile peace by staying quiet for a decade. I had simply been the only one holding the specific documentation that would have let the rest of my family's own quiet, unexamined doubts finally resolve into something they could act on together. I decided, finally, sitting at my own kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in early June, 12 days before Simone's wedding, that I wasn't going to disrupt the wedding itself. Simone deserved a wedding day untouched by any of this, regardless of what her mother had done 2 decades earlier. But I also decided that same evening that I was done protecting a 20-year-old lie simply because it had become comfortable for everyone except me to leave unexamined, and that the right moment to finally say the truth out loud, calmly and completely, was going to be soon, deliberate, and entirely on my own terms rather than Camille's. I scheduled a family meeting for the Sunday after Simone's wedding, 8 days after that toast in the Newport Ballroom, at my mother's assisted living facility's small private meeting room, framing the invitation only as some things about Mom's care and the estate we should all discuss together, which was true in its own way, even if it understated considerably what I actually intended to bring into that room. In the 8 days between deciding and the meeting itself, I spent most evenings at my own kitchen table finalizing the folder, cross-referencing Dr. Castellanos' report against the original trust language one more time, calling Priya twice more to make sure I understood exactly how to frame the request for an independent financial review going forward without it sounding, to Camille or to my mother, like an accusation dressed up as a formality. I called Marcus Jr. once more during that stretch, this time to tell him directly what I'd found, giving him several days to process the information privately before the family meeting itself, a choice I made deliberately, wanting at least one other sibling in the room who wasn't hearing everything for the very first time in front of our visibly fragile mother. I brought with me a single folder, carefully organized, a copy of the original 1998 trust document, the 2004 beneficiary change form, Dr. Castellanos' full forensic analysis, and a summary of my concerns regarding Camille's management of our mother's current accounts under power of attorney, along with a formal request, drafted with Priya's guidance, for an independent financial review going forward. Marcus Jr., Renata, my mother, present but requiring things to be explained simply and slowly given her condition, and Camille were all in the room. I remember the specific quality of that room, small and beige, decorated with the deliberately soft, unthreatening art common to facilities like my mother's, sunlight coming through a single window onto the round table where all 6 of us eventually sat. I opened the folder and said calmly, I need to tell all of you something I've known for 11 years, and I need to show you the actual documentation because I think what happened and what we've all believed happened are 2 different things. I laid out the 1998 trust first, then the 2004 beneficiary change, then Dr. Castellanos's report, walking through each document slowly, factually the way I'd walk a client through a discrepancy in their own financial records. Camille's face, watching the 3rd document land on the table, went through several colors in the space of about 10 seconds. She said too quickly, "This is insane. Dad wanted me to have more. He told me that himself before he died. You're twisting a private conversation into some kind of conspiracy." I said evenly, I'm not relying on a private conversation, Camille. I'm relying on a forensic document examiner's professional analysis of a signature dated 6 weeks before a man with confirmed cognitive impairment from advanced cancer and heavy pain medication supposedly signed away 2/3 of what he'd spent his whole life explicitly promising to split evenly among his 4 children. I slid Dr. Castellanos's report across the table toward her, watching her scan the technical language about pen pressure and letter formation without, as far as I could tell, actually absorbing any of it, her eyes moving quickly past the specifics toward the summary conclusion at the bottom. Camille tried a different angle, her voice rising for the first time. Even if that's true, why now? Why wait 11 years and then blow up my daughter's wedding week to punish me? I said calmly, I'm not punishing you. I'm telling the truth finally after 11 years of protecting you from a consequence you clearly never once worried about yourself. I heard you on the phone 4 days before the wedding, Camille. You knew exactly what that money was and where it came from this entire time. There was a specific moment in that meeting I want to include, because it's the closest thing to genuine vulnerability I saw from Camille the entire time. After the room had been quiet for nearly a minute, she put her head in her hands and said quietly, almost to herself, I was 27, I was terrified. I had nothing and Dad was dying, and I convinced myself, sitting in Frank's office that day, that it wasn't really stealing if it was money that was going to come to me eventually anyway. I told myself that lie so many times over so many years that I actually started believing it. It wasn't a full apology, and it didn't come with any offer to actually address the 20 years of financial harm that decision had caused her 3 siblings. But it was the first genuinely honest sentence I'd heard her say about any of this in 11 years of watching her maintain the opposite story, and something in me unexpectedly softened slightly at hearing it, even knowing it changed nothing about what needed to happen next. Camille had no further response that survived being said out loud in that room after that admission. My mother, following the conversation as best she could, said only quietly, tears in her eyes, I don't understand how this happened. And I told her gently that none of this was her fault, that she trusted the people around her the way any mother would, and that the point of this conversation wasn't to relitigate the past, but to make sure her remaining care and finances were protected going forward clearly and honestly, by all 4 of her children equally. Renata, who had said very little during the entire meeting, spoke up near the end, addressing Camille directly for the first time. I need you to understand something, Camille. I'm not angry about the money, not really, not anymore, not after all these years. I'm angry that you let all of us believe a story about who you were and who we were that wasn't true. I'm angry that Danielle carried this alone for 11 years because she was trying to protect the rest of us from exactly this conversation. Camille didn't respond to that directly, but I watched something in her posture shift, a small, visible flinch, as though Renata's specific framing had landed somewhere Dr. Castellanos's technical report hadn't quite managed to reach. I didn't raise my voice once, not a single time through the entire meeting. I didn't need to. The documents had already said everything that needed saying, and this is the line I said quietly near the end of it that I want you to remember. I spent 11 years protecting your version of the story, Camille, because I thought silence was a kindness. It wasn't a kindness. It was just a debt I kept paying so you'd never have to. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, and considerably messier than any neat resolution would have looked from the outside. Camille did not admit wrongdoing that day or in the months that followed, maintaining in every subsequent conversation that our father had wanted her to have more regardless of what the documentation showed. She did, under pressure from Marcus Jr. And Renata, once they'd had time to absorb the evidence themselves, agreed to step down as our mother's power of attorney, replaced by a professional fiduciary the four of us jointly selected and now jointly oversee, a change that has, in the year since, revealed no further irregularities. Though it has also revealed, in the accounting records now available to all of us, that Camille's management fees and reimbursements over the previous 7 years amounted to nearly $40,000 beyond what any formal arrangement had ever authorized. I want to describe the process of uncovering that additional $40,000 a little more fully, because it was its own smaller, quieter gut punch that arrived months after the main confrontation. Once the professional fiduciary, a careful woman named Grace Onyema, had time to fully review 7 years of account activity. Grace called me directly in September, 3 months after the family meeting, to walk through her preliminary findings, and I remember sitting in my home office listening to her describe, line by line, a pattern of small, regular withdrawals labeled caregiving reimbursement that had never been authorized by any formal agreement among the siblings, totaling, by her careful calculation, $38,400 across 7 years. It wasn't a shock in the way the original 2004 discovery had been. By September, I'd already recalibrated my entire understanding of who Camille was capable of being. But it was, in its own way, a confirmation that the pattern I'd spent a decade quietly documenting had never actually stopped, had simply continued, unexamined, right up until the moment someone finally looked closely enough to see it. My relationship with Camille has not recovered, and I don't expect it ever will. We haven't spoken directly since a brief, stilted exchange of texts that October regarding a shared decision about our mother's holiday visit schedule. I think about that fact more than I expected to, given how clearly justified I feel in the distance between us now. There's a particular kind of grief in losing a sibling relationship that was never actually healthy to begin with. A grief that doesn't behave the way grief for something genuinely good behaves, less an ache for what's gone, more a slow, complicated reckoning with how long I spent mistaking the relationship's mere continuation for something worth preserving. My relationship with Marcus Jr. is closer now than it's been in years, forged unexpectedly through the shared work of untangling our mother's finances together, a partnership neither of us anticipated but that has become quietly one of the better outcomes of the entire ordeal. We speak nearly every week now, sometimes about our mother's care, increasingly about ordinary things entirely unrelated to any of this, a normalcy that feels, after everything, like its own small victory. My relationship with Renata, always steady, remains exactly what it was, if anything deepened slightly by finally being fully included in something I'd carried alone for over a decade. She told me once that autumn, "I wish you'd trusted me with this sooner, but I understand completely why you didn't, and I'm not going to spend energy being hurt about a decision you made trying to protect all of us." My mother's understanding of events remains partial, softened somewhat by her cognitive decline, though she has, on several occasions since that meeting, referenced what Camille did with a clarity that suggests some core recognition of the betrayal has settled in regardless of the details she can no longer fully retain. I visit her most Sundays now, and on one visit that November, apropos of nothing, she took my hand and said, "You always did carry more than your share, Danielle, even when you were small." I should have noticed that sooner. I don't know how much of that comment reflected full, sustained understanding of everything that had happened, and how much was simply my mother, in whatever clarity remained available to her that particular afternoon, recognizing something true about the shape of our family that had been visible in some form for decades. I've made peace with that incompleteness, understanding that full, sustained comprehension was never realistically available to her anymore, and that protecting her from unnecessary distress now matters more than ensuring she holds every detail with total accuracy. The redemptive thread, if there is one worth naming here, runs through Aisha and Simone. Simone, married only a handful of months by the time the full story became clear to her, reached out to me directly that autumn on her own initiative, saying only, "I need you to know I don't think any less of you for staying quiet as long as you did. I think I understand now why it took so long. And I think what you did was still right." I remember reading that message standing in my own kitchen and feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a decade, not vindication exactly, but something quieter and, I think, more valuable, the sense that the accurate version of events, once finally spoken, had found its way to at least one member of the next generation without my having had to force it on her, that she'd arrived at her own understanding of it on her own terms and had chosen, deliberately, to hold the truth rather than the comfortable story her mother had spent 2 decades perfecting. It wasn't the reconciliation with Camille I'll never get, but it was, I think, the more important reconciliation available to me. A niece I've watched grow up choosing on her own to hold the accurate version of events rather than the comfortable one, breaking, in her own quiet way, a pattern that had defined our family for 2 decades before she was even old enough to understand it. I want to close this section with one more small, private piece, because it's the part of the aftermath that's mattered most to me personally, even though it has nothing directly to do with Camille at all. David and I marked our 20th wedding anniversary that September, 3 months after the family meeting, and over dinner that evening he raised a glass and said simply, "Here's to 20 years of marriage and to finally, after all of them, actually knowing every single thing you're carrying." It wasn't a dramatic toast, nothing like the one Camille had given at Simone's wedding months earlier. But it captured something I hadn't fully realized I needed until he said it out loud. That the true cost of an 11-year secret hadn't only been the strain it eventually placed on my relationship with Camille, but the smaller, quieter distance it had without my fully realizing it placed between David and me, a distance that closed almost immediately and almost completely, the moment I finally stopped carrying the whole weight of it alone. Some truths are too expensive to tell, I told myself for 11 years, and staying quiet is its own form of generosity. It took a hallway conversation I was never meant to overhear 4 days before my niece's wedding to finally teach me that I had the sentence backward the entire time. Staying quiet wasn't generosity toward Camille. It was a debt I kept quietly paying for over a decade so that she would never once have to. I think often now about the specific mechanics of how a lie like this survives for 20 years inside a family that, from the outside, would have described itself as close, loving, ordinary. It doesn't survive through some single, dramatic act of ongoing deception. It survives through the accumulated weight of everyone around it deciding, individually, at dozens of separate moments, that this particular occasion isn't the right one to ask a hard question. Not at a birthday party, not at a holiday dinner, not while someone is still grieving, not while a wedding is being planned. Each individual decision to stay quiet feels, in the moment, like kindness or patience or simply good manners. It's only decades later, laid end to end, that you can see the actual shape of what all that individual restraint built together. Not a family being kind to each other, but a family collectively, unknowingly, protecting one person's 20-year-old lie by each independently deciding it wasn't worth disturbing the peace to examine. If I could tell my younger self anything, sitting on that study floor in 2014 holding 2 documents that told 2 completely different stories about the same event, it would be this. The discomfort of asking the hard question immediately is almost always smaller than the discomfort of finally asking it a decade later, once the lie has had time to become load-bearing in other people's lives. I don't regret protecting my mother's fragile peace for as long as I reasonably could. But I do think, looking back, that 11 years is considerably longer than as long as I could ever actually needed to be, and that somewhere in those 11 years, I mistook my own fear for someone else's well-being more often than I'd like to admit. If this story landed for you, share it with someone who's spent years protecting a family secret that was never actually theirs to protect. They'll know exactly why, probably before they finish reading the message. Comment below and tell me your own version of a truth you carried longer than you should have, whatever form it took in your own family. And if you want to hear the next one, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's always another quiet person out there, somewhere, finally deciding that 11 years or 20 is long enough to carry someone else's secret alone. Thank you, genuinely, for staying with this story all the way to the end. I know it was a long one, longer than most of what I usually bring you, but some truths simply take the time they take to tell properly, and after carrying this particular one quietly for over a decade myself, I didn't want to rush past a single year of it.